I'm Justin Meggitt, and I'm one of the academics at the Faculty of Divinity. And I'd like to introduce you today to the first of a series of short talks that are the faculty's contribution to this year's Cambridge Festival. I hope you'll find them interesting, and they'll give you an insight into the kind of research and teaching that we undertake in the faculty. Thank you very much.
Religion is often associated with acts of terror. But does religion cause terrorism? Many critics of religion and its defenders have added little to our understanding by treating the question as though it can only be answered by a simple yes or no. And the basic point that I would like to make in this brief talk is that the question needs to be amended for it to deliver any useful answers. I will have to start with definitions, because definitions have consequences. One of the first questions anyone studying religion is faced with is possibly also one of the hardest ones to answer adequately. What is a religion? Although this might strike many as obvious and not requiring further comment, for those involved in the study of religion professionally, it's proven an enormously difficult one to answer and clearly relevant to the question before us today. There are a number of reasons why it's hard to define religion. It is, for example, hard to determine what characteristics unequivocally identify something as a religion, and many cases where the classification is disputed. It's unclear, for example, whether Confucianism is a religion, or the Juche ideology of North Korea, or the traditions of indigenous peoples throughout the world. It's also notoriously difficult to find terms in other languages that closely equate with what is currently meant by the English word religion. The Arabic term deen does not mean the same thing, nor the Sanskrit term dharma. One of the things, however, that has emerged, perhaps most acutely in the definitional debate surrounding the term, is the extent to which religion, as it's currently conceived, may be a relatively recent creation that reflects the circumstances of its birth. More specifically, it's often claimed that the idea that religions are things that are primarily concerned with matters of belief and doctrine reflects the origins of the concept in Christian and more specifically Protestant culture, where such things are paramount in a way that they are not elsewhere. Further, the idea that science, politics, law, economics, medicine and other matters are self-evidently distinguishable from religion and constitute separate domains of human activity reflects the European Reformation and Enlightenment context that shaped the genesis and subsequent development of the concept, over and against the idea of the secular. Indeed, for many scholars, religion and secularism are mutually constitutive. You can't really have one without the other. Although such definitional debates might look like the kind of inconsequential navel-gazing that some academics love, they are in fact of relevance when we examine the question of whether religion causes terrorism. Indeed, they're foundational. I'll give you an example. When a commentator in the media or elsewhere says that terrorists who clearly identify themselves as adherents of a particular religion experience real grievances, but then say that they are political, social and economic in character and not religious, we can see a specific and rather narrow definition of what constitutes religion at work. Such a view is unlikely to be shared by the perpetrators of such terrorist acts themselves. Indeed, this tension over what exactly constitutes religion might well play a part in explaining some acts of violence, as some terrorists seek to assert or reassert the totalising claims of their understanding of their particular religion, against those whom they see, not necessarily inaccurately, as eviscerating their faith by limiting it to matters of private belief and worship. While outsider accounts of religion are clearly legitimate, they're far from unproblematic. It's important not to underestimate the interpretive chasm that needs to be bridged between religious terrorists and those who seek to understand them. I'm not going to resolve these definitional problems in this short talk, but I would note that explanations of terrorism that absolve religion and specific religions, because they see things other than religious ideas as explaining an act of terror, need to be queried, as they may overlook other things that may be understood quite legitimately as religious, not least by the perpetrators. For an adherent of a religion, the religious realm is not just a matter of belief or doctrine, indeed in many religions those are not actually that important, but can encompass a range of other elements, such as the ritual, the mythic, the experiential, the ethical, the legal, the organisational, social, material, artistic, political, economic, spatial, and temporal. It's also useful when we think about this question of the relationship between religion and terrorism to be aware that what might appear to be salient may well be counterintuitive. For example, Mark Juergensmeyer, the author of this very influential book, has drawn attention to the significance of what he calls cosmic war in understanding the religiously inspired acts of terrorism. That is, where terrorists believe themselves to be participating in an existential battle between religion and irreligion, good and evil, order and chaos. Yet cosmic love could be just as significant a factor and just as widely discernible, if you look for it. As Ariel Glucklich has suggested, terrorism may come from a hedonistic desire for divine love and the need to do whatever is necessary to obtain or maintain it. As we think about the relationship between religion and terrorism, it's also important that we note that claims about the causal relationship between religion and violence in general are not necessarily relevant for our purposes. Although virtually all definitions of terrorism involve a violent act or the threat of a violent act, terrorism is usually distinguished from other kinds of violence, even if commentators are not always in agreement about how this is the case, whether, for example, it is the perpetrators, the victims, or the intended effects that set it apart. It's therefore reasonable to question whether claims about the causal relationship between religion and violence, however attractive and legion these are, tell us anything helpful. And they definitely are legion. Here's a recent article by Matthew Rowley, which identifies over 300 ways it's been claimed that religion causes violence. But actually, what any explanation of terrorism requires is why this particular form of violence is chosen by the perpetrators, not violence in general. Also, when we think about the relationship between religion and terrorism, we need to take account of the variety of religions. Whilst the question, does religion cause terrorism, invites us to advance suggestions about the causal relationship of religion in the abstract to terrorism, the variegated character of religions may limit the explanatory value of any theories proffered. Thus, rather than ask, does religion cause terrorism, if you want to say something that has any real-world utility, it's more helpful to ask, does religion X cause terrorism? Or, to be more accurate, given that the number of terrorists who can be identified as adherents of any specific religion is never more than a minuscule fraction of the total number of adherents of that religion, we should ask, does religion X sometimes cause terrorism? Now, many scholars are, however, very wary of talking about the potential relationship of a specific religion to terrorism and are far happier dealing with abstractions. This is in part because many claims made today about the relationship between specific religions, such as, for example, Islam, and terrorism, are often self-servingly selective and implicitly racist, and probably reflect prejudiced Orientalist discourses in which the East, and the religions primarily associated with it, are constructed as barbarous, irrational, and inherently violent. Exploring the relationship between a specific religion and terrorism also runs the risk of appearing to accept uncritically the religious claims and justifications of the terrorists themselves. This is often not only objectionable to many adherents of the religion with which the terrorists identify, but may have damaging consequences for them, leading to their stigmatisation and victimisation by association. Indeed, partly to prevent this and put clear water between terrorists and other members of a religion, it's become increasingly common to hear the claim, and not just from adherents themselves, that terrorists are perverting or abusing a religion, or the true form of it. It's also not unusual to hear it being said that terrorism is common to all religions, not just the one to which terrorists say they belong, an argument that is intended once again to protect a specific religion and its adherents from unwelcome, hostile attention. Nonetheless, despite its potential risks, I'd argue that it's not per se unreasonable to ask whether a specific religion might sometimes cause terrorism. Some, however, might object that the revised question, does religion X sometimes cause terrorism, is still too general to be useful. After all, it's common in terrorism literature to identify a specific form of a religion as more likely to be associated with terrorism, whether a generic subtype of the religion in question, such as extremist, radical, fundamentalist, or an identifiable named movement within it, such as Salafism within Islam, or Christian identity, or say the Ku Klux Klan within Christianity. While there are numerous problems with the utility of such labels, for example, terms such as fundamentalist are often evaluative and pejorative rather than descriptive, and Salafism encompasses a range of positions on questions of violence, many completely hostile to the concept of terrorism, it is not unreasonable to accept this narrower focus. Therefore, we should amend the question further so that it reads, does some form of religion X sometimes cause terrorism? But that then brings up the question of causation. There's a further way in which the question needs to be qualified if it's to have any utility. Is it asking us to determine whether religion can be the or a cause of an act of terror? And if so, what kind of cause? The or a long-term, underlying, a root cause, one that is more immediate, triggering, precipitant, approximate? Or is it legitimate to think of it as a cause that lies somewhere between the two extremes? Can we talk about degrees of causation when we think about terrorism, just as in law they are practically accepted for the purposes of distributing responsibility and proportionality in sentencing? Does the question as originally worded, does religion cause terrorism, exclude the possibility that religion might be a factor in terrorism only in the presence of something else that facilitates its activation? There is more that could be said, but clearly it would be useful if any questions asked about the relationship between religion and terrorism recognise that causation is far from straightforward. The question should be revised yet further to take this into account. Does some form of religion X sometimes cause, in some manner, terrorism? Well, to conclude, if we wish to answer the question, does religion cause terrorism, we should begin by reflecting critically on what we understand by religion and the extent of its domain, and what it is about terrorism that requires an answer that is not identical to the question, does religion cause violence? Then, given that religion has no transhistorical or transcultural essence, and the lack of clarity as to what kind of relationship between religion and terrorism can legitimately be considered causal, if we wish to say anything potentially useful, we should rewrite the question in the inelegant way I've just suggested. Does some form of religion X sometimes cause, in some manner, terrorism? Now, the answer to this question may be obvious. It's hard to find a religion whose adherents have not included terrorists of some kind. Even avowedly pacifist faiths, like that of the Duke of Boers, beloved of pacifist Tolstoy, have had their fair share of violent terrorists. You can see here from an article from the 1950s about a group called the Sons of Freedom within the Duke of Boers, who carried out a number of acts of terror. Any cursory examination of terrorism databases also reveals that there is, at the very least, a clear correlation between individuals and groups who identify as religious and many acts of terrorism. Now, why, however, this might be the case is a different question. Although there may be sufficient resemblances between different religious terrorists that some general theories, like Jürgen Meyer's concept of a cosmic war, may have some explanatory power, when it comes to religious terrorism, the devil is almost certainly in the detail. However frustrating that is for those of us who would like the world to be a simple place, and such questions to be a simple matter of black and white. Thank you.